Hello, and thank you for joining us for this session, Zero Carbon and Zero Energy Codes, Key Policy Tools to Meet Climate Goals. I'm Ralph Danola, I'm CEO at New Buildings Institute. Before we begin, I have a couple of housekeeping things to tell you about. First, you're muted and we can't hear you. This helps to keep down the background noise so that everyone can hear our speakers. I want to direct you to the dashboard. You should be able to see that on the right-hand side of your screen. If you're having technical difficulties and cannot see the slides or hear our speakers, you can ask a question in the question pane and in the dashboard, and we will help you as we go. Please do ask questions as they come up. We will take those one or two questions between speakers, and then we'll save other questions for the end of the presentation. At the end of this webinar session, you'll be given the opportunity to complete a short survey. We encourage you to do that so that we can have a better understanding of how you like what we're doing and what else you need to see in the future. You'll receive a follow-up email tomorrow with a link to the recording and the slides for this session. We'd like to take this opportunity to thank the sponsors and supporters, partners of our webinar series and of NBI. Because of your generous support, we're able to provide this content, and we appreciate your support. Next slide. So NBI is a nonprofit organization. We're based in Portland, Oregon. We've been operating for more than 20 years. NBI makes buildings more efficient. We shape the future with innovation, research, design guidance, and advanced building energy policy. We focus in three primary areas: zero energy leadership and market development, the development of best practices in new and existing buildings, and continuous code and policy innovation. Next slide. NBI was founded in 1997, and really the primary reason for developing NBI as a nonprofit was because of the frustration and the lack of advancement of energy codes nationally. So you can see the original mission to create a national collaborative to encourage and support workable energy codes and design guidelines. And today we continue that work, and we've expanded our program focus and work to advance the building industry overall towards zero energy and now zero carbon buildings. Next slide. We know that the building sector can achieve significant energy and greenhouse gas reductions today, and that getting the building sector to zero provides one of the most effective near-term approaches to achieving our climate goals. Since 2012, NBI has been tracking the advancement of zero energy buildings, and since that time, we've seen 700% growth in the number of buildings targeted or achieving zero energy. So we're asking you to please join us in adding new and emerging zero energy projects to our registry. We have a call out right now, and we'd like to have more projects added. You can click the link provided in this slide once you have the slide deck, and you can register projects. We really would like to see the number of projects listed grow, and through that information we gain really important information and insights about what is really working to get buildings to zero. Next slide. And now I'd like to introduce today's panel, starting with Jim Edelson, the Director of Codes and Policy here at NBI. Jim has been working on energy codes and policy at NBI for nearly 20 years. He served on multiple code boards and climate policy committees in Oregon, Wisconsin, and the International Code Council. He currently sits as a voting member of ASHRAE 89.1, and Jim is currently working on projects related to zero energy and zero carbon in New York and Vermont, while supporting development of energy code measures for stretch codes and the 2021 IECC. With his NBI colleagues, Jim has published several papers on the intersection between energy codes and climate policy. Jim will provide an overview of the zero energy landscape and the 2021 IECC Zero Energy Appendix. Next up, we'll have Charles Ely, Charles is an architect, mechanical engineer, and author with 40 years experience in energy efficient and sustainable design. During his career, he's made significant contributions to California energy standards, ASHRAE Standard 90.1, energy codes in Hong Kong, Hawaii, Guam, American Samoa, and Australia. He's also developed a number of important technical manuals and publications, and served as the founding executive director of the Collaborative for High Performance Schools. Charles is also an NBI fellow, and he will be reviewing Architecture 2030's Zero Code. Then we'll be hearing from Christopher Meyer with the California Energy Commission. Christopher currently serves as the manager of the Energy Commission's Building Standards Office in the Energy Division. He has over 25 years of successful experience in staff, program, and project management, environmental compliance management, archaeology, multi-party coordination, inspection, environmental planning, business development, marketing, and in erosion and environmental protection inspection. And finally, Bill Updike from Integral Group. Bill is a passionate advocate for climate, green building, environmental policy for decades, and is a recognized leader in green building, urban sustainable development, and climate policy and planning. He currently serves as a principal with the deep green engineering and sustainable consulting company Integral Group. Prior to joining Integral Group, Bill spearheaded green building and climate policy for the city government in Washington, D.C. So we have an excellent panel for you today, and I'm going to hand it over to Jim.
Next slide. Thanks, Ralph, and thanks everyone for listening in today and showing support for this topic. The high interest in today's webinar, I think, is a direct reflection of an observable phenomenon. Most of the country, and for that matter, most of the world, is taking the climate challenge very seriously, and they want real plans and solutions to address the challenge. One reflection of this you see on the screen is the We Are Still In organization, which is tracking how much of the economy in the United States is following the Paris Agreement and committing to achieving its objectives. As you can see, and Ralph and I just updated this slide earlier this week, it is growing, and it's certainly more than the majority of the economy and population of the states. This, of course, is a direct rebuke to President Trump's energy and climate policies. But that is the easy part, rebuking this president. The hard part are the solutions and the pathways that cities and states across the country are following. Next slide. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. The path is becoming clearer, fortunately, in the building sector. This is a slide that I'm borrowing from Andrew Lasky of the World Green Building Council, and it really shows a quite simple and elegant equation. Achieving the Paris Agreement means urgent action towards net zero carbon building goals. Net zero carbon is more innovative today than net zero energy, but I think net zero carbon in the vernacular is a substitute for or a representation of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so when Charles speaks, you'll hear more about how this transition from energy to carbon, how it's measured, what is CO2 equivalent. We'll be talking more about that today. But this equation is the one we want to bring forward. Next slide. As a basis, we'll just review here the zero energy building definition that's frequently used. Usually it's netted out over 1 year or more. A amount of energy used is equivalent to the amount of energy generated or procured in the site. That is a measure of net zero energy. And these are some of the terms that are used to when we address the zero energy building nexus. Next slide. When we talk about zero net carbon, what we, as I said, this is a surrogate for emissions impacts of the building and its operations, and maybe potentially including its construction. But in this definition, just for on the net zero carbon operations, it is taking that balance of the amount of energy used, the carbon impact of the energy used is equal or less than the amount of carbon-free electricity generated or procured. And you'll see this is the first theme that you'll see throughout today's presentations is how cities and states and other jurisdictions are beginning to address the carbon metric and talking about its building sector policy. Next slide. Fortunately, there is what I think is an excellent publication that was just released in the past month by Adam Hinge for the for the International Partners of Energy Efficiency Cooperation. And this is a excellent summary of worldwide uses of zero energy and zero carbon definitions, and some summary of policies. We will have this link on our website after the presentation. Next slide. The second theme I want to address is the one about the complexity that is inherent in moving from what is our typical energy efficiency paradigm to this low and zero energy or zero carbon paradigm. This is a representation that MBI uses to talk about the complementary elements in these low and zero energy buildings. And this is a second theme you'll see today. A policy does address on top, as you see, the energy efficiency optimization, but it also has to understand about what are the renewable energy generation sources, are they on site, are they procured off site, and in all of this, how, since this will be electricity dominated, what is the impact and what role can the building play in managing the impacts on the electricity grid? Next slide. And then the third theme I wanted to emphasize, and you'll see going forward today, is that, as Ralph mentioned, there's a tailwind. And that's why I think we have such a high interest in this subject at this point in zero energy and zero carbon policies, because there is that tailwind. This is another representation of the database that Ralph was talking about earlier. And we want to show the growth, and it is now over 500 buildings, but it is really quite encouraging to see that the type of building and the type of ownership of building has really spread from the public sector to the private sector, and we expect that to continue. Next slide. Another way to measure the tailwind is now the financial industry and the analysis done here by Technovar. And this is a report that is estimating the growth of the zero energy and zero carbon market from 2015 to 2021. And they calculate there is a 39% compound annual growth rate. Based on the mathematics, that means this market is doubling approximately every 2 years. And as you see, this means more markets for advanced controls, insulation, and all the design and construction that goes along with that. Next slide. So now I'm going to turn with those three themes to the types of policies and codes you're going to hear about from our three speakers. I will talk first a little bit about the ZE Appendix of 2021 IECC, which is a model code, and it'll be on the residential side. And then Charles will talk about the zero code and many of the components that go into it, especially calculating source energy values and calculating off-site procurement of renewables. And then Chris will talk about Title 24 2019, its path to get the residential to net zero or nearly net zero, and how that works, and introduces the grid component. And then Bill is going to conclude with a series of discussions about city efforts and some unique efforts in Washington, D.C. and Vancouver, BC, and the STEP codes and the approaches that they are doing. So as you see, there's a wide range of policies being introduced. They're not piloted, they're actually being adopted. And so this is a really exciting time for this. And at this point, I just want to quickly mention another paper that we will link, was written by Chris Perry of ACEEE. And this is an excellent summary of zero net energy policies and a path, especially for the model codes to get to zero energy code. And that will also be linked on our website. So with that, I think we will turn it over in case there's a question now, or Ralph.
Yeah, so we do have a couple of excellent questions, and maybe I'll start with this first one, and I would encourage the speakers that are coming up to try and address them as well. So one question is about embodied carbon versus operating carbon, and the question basically is asking, there's evidence that suggests that embodied carbon is significantly less than operating carbon over the building life cycle. However, we know as you approach zero energy and operating energy, then the importance of embodied carbon's more evident. So Jim, do you want to address that?
Yeah, the scope of our talk today, and I believe the other talks, will be on the operating carbon use. But as, of course, you get towards net zero operations, the embodied carbon is considerably more important. And there are efforts underway to measure that. It's still, I would say, in its early days. There is no necessary agreement on life cycle analysis of all the materials that are involved. It is a much more complex calculation, but we do think that there is a role to begin considering embodied carbon as policies move forward. It's just not in the current policies.
Yeah, and I would also suggest USGBC is looking at this as they advance the LEED rating system, thinking about maybe an all-encompassing carbon metric for buildings, both embodied and operating carbon, as the LEED rating system moves forward. There are more and more modeling tools, and recently in September at Carbon Smart Buildings Day, that was a one-day conference in San Francisco, was an affiliate event to the Global Climate Action Summit. There were many presentations on this topic, and I think you can access the presentations at Carbon Smart Buildings Day. Should we move on to the next presenter? Okay, so next up, we have Charles. Oh, sorry.
We have the ZE appendix that Jim needs to cover here.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, right. So that was the introduction. Now I'll move into the first policy we want to cover, and that is the ZE appendix to the 2021 IECC. This is a proposal being developed by NRDC and MBI. It will be an appendix we are going to propose it as an appendix inside the IECC document. That means that it is not part of the normative language that is adopted by a city or state unless it is specifically selected during its legislative process. This appendix will modify the ERI rating index approach so that it gets both a pre-renewables low energy score and a post-renewables net zero score. And that, please, we have a fact sheet, next slide, that will be available on the website after the presentation, and the links will be easier to follow once you get the slides. But we urge you to follow this and all the other IECC proposals, because this is a really important effort, and every community and every governmental member should find out how to vote, because this is the way that we can really influence the future trends for our model codes. Thank you, Connie.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just follow up on that first question. I'm happy to see that people are responding to the questions in the question pane as well. So Sarah King has shared that on embodied carbon, Skanska is working closely with the University of Washington's Carbon Leadership Forum to develop an open sourced embodied carbon calculator for construction. And it's in its pilot stage, but it's a great tool that's available to use. All right, so next up, let's move to Charles Ely. Charles, take it away.
Okay, next slide, please. The national and international Zero Code was released in April, and it's really pretty simple. The first thing you do is design your building to be in compliance with the latest version of 90.1. And after that, you install on-site renewable energy, or you procure off-site renewable energy to get to zero. Next. The Zero Code is supported by a website. You can download the code and the supporting documents. And there's also 2 energy calculators, one for California and one for the other parts of the country, that can help you determine how much energy can be generated or how much would need to be procured off-site. Next. Perhaps the most significant innovation with the California Zero Code is the metric that we're using to measure energy performance and credit renewable energy. We're using what we call TDS, or time-dependent source energy. TDV, or time-dependent valued energy, is still used for code compliance, but the Zero Code uses TDS. As you'll see in a moment, it provides a strong incentive for grid harmonization and storage. Next slide. And finally, we've worked with the CEC and the developers of CBAC-COM to add features to the official California software to support the Zero Code. This includes a model for PV, a battery model, and also you can look at multiple metrics, including TDS and TDV. Next slide. Next. Most of us are familiar with the concept of source energy, but with California, we have a little bit different twist on the concept. With source energy, of course, you look upstream at the energy that was used to generate the electricity, and you also consider the electricity that's lost in the process of transmission and distribution. This is, of course, a very simple diagram, like Thomas Edison's original Pearl Street system in New York. Next slide. But the modern electric grid is way more complicated than the original Pearl Street system. There are multiple generators of different types scattered around, often in remote locations, and these feed into high voltage transmission lines. Next. And this power is then stepped down to lower voltages as it reaches customers. Next. And modern grids also have intermittent generators like wind and solar. Power has traditionally flowed in just one direction from central power plants to customers, but this is starting to change with Z&E buildings. Next slide. A couple of months ago, in May, California had 22 megawatts of renewable energy on the grid, and solar represented more than half of this, wind being a distant second. Next slide. In 2017, almost 30% of California's power was from eligible renewable energy sources, and in mid-September, Senate Bill 100 was signed by Governor Brown, and this calls for California to be 100% carbon-free by 2045. The bill also moves up the target for 50% from 2030 to 26, and set some other goals along the way. But right now, the renewable energy portfolios in California don't include large hydro, but for the 2045 goal, they of course will. Next slide, Connie. To make things a bit more complicated, the mix of electricity in California is changing throughout the day. This is a diagram of electricity production for a typical sunny spring day when the load is moderate. The yellow band represents solar, and the orange band represents wind contributions, and the dotted line is the total load on the grid. So in this particular day, solar production was being curtailed to avoid overgeneration. Next slide, or next. So this black line then represents the net load that must be met by conventional or dispatchable generators, and the space between the solid line and the dotted line begins to form the infamous California duck, and I guess you could sort of see the resemblance. Next slide, or next. So on this particular day, if you add load to the grid between about 9 in the morning and 6 at night, the marginal source energy would basically be zero, because that additional load would be met by taking off or reactivating some of the solar capability that's already been curtailed. Next. However, in the early evening hours, when the sun goes down, the source energy is high, and the gas generators would come on to modulate things. Next. So you may be wondering where we're going with all this. So we're leading into time-dependent source energy. One of the important features of this is that TDS tracks carbon emissions on a near exact basis. The graph at the bottom shows carbon emissions, and the one at the top, source energy, hourly source energy. And really the only difference between these graphs is the scale. So when carbon is low, so is source energy. And you can see in this particular case, there's some curtailment on Saturday. Next slide. TDS consists of a 8,760 time series, but it's easier to visualize this if you look at the average source energy for each month and each hour of the day, which this graph does. And this shows how source energy dips in the middle of the day when all the solar comes online, and it also shows how it spikes in the morning and in the early evening when the sun goes down and the buildings are still operated. So the lesson here is that during periods of high source energy or high carbon, we want to shift load, and this is what we think the Zero Code will encourage. Next slide. To show how TDS works in building design, you start with a typical electricity load, which is shown at the top, and then you subtract the on-site solar production, and the net electricity load is then this goal-shaped graph shown in the lower left-hand corner. You multiply that times the TDS multipliers for each hour, and you end up with the hourly source energy. So in this particular case, the building achieved zero on a site basis, as shown in the lower left-hand corner, but when the TDS multipliers were applied, it's no longer zero, because a lot of that solar production in the middle of the day was discounted. Next slide. And next. So with site energy and most other flat metrics, you know, a megawatt hour of renewable energy from wind or solar or hydro they're all considered equal. But this is no longer the case when TDS is the metric. Next. This slide shows typical daily production for wind and solar. And in California, wind typically peaks in the morning and in the afternoon with a lull in the middle of the day. And solar, on the other hand, is a big hump in the middle of the day. So when the TDS multipliers are applied to this, the impact of wind is amplified and the impact of solar is reduced. Next slide. So this is the TDS curve that we previously described, or a representative of it. And then the next slide. This is the solar energy purchased by the California ISO through the Northern California Hub and for all of 2012. And you can see that it's less in the winter, more in the summer, but there's a big bump in the middle of the day. And this big bump sort of aligns with the periods when source energy is low and carbon emissions are low. Next. This shows wind production from the same Northern California Trading Hub for 2012. And this surface is kind of saddle-shaped, with more wind in the summer and less in the winter, and then there's kind of a lull in the middle of the day. So you can see here that the benefit of wind energy, when you look at it on an hourly basis, is greater than that of solar. Next. So what we did is we modeled a typical solar system in each of the 16 California climates. And this slide shows the avoided source energy for each of the climates. They all range around 3,300 BTUs per kilowatt hour, which is pretty close to the 3412 site energy number. Next slide. But what this slide shows is when you go off site and you've got an opportunity to procure wind or geothermal or hydro, and the avoided source energy for wind, as you can see here, is quite a bit larger than that of solar. The solar number here is a little bigger because when you go off site, there's a lot of tracking collectors, and the power factors are larger and they perform much better. So the message here is that TDS as a metric will really begin to encourage a lot of grid harmonization. Next slide. So what I want to talk about now is offsite procurement. Net metering is the most common arrangement for small buildings. The customer pays for the net energy that's used. When PV production is less than building use, the PV system supplies the building, but otherwise the PV system can actually pump power directly into the grid. And in this case, the meter can actually run backwards. Next slide, Connie. Another arrangement with larger systems is for the PV system to have its own meter that feeds directly into the grid. This is common for direct power purchase agreements and large campus systems and so forth. And with this arrangement, the tariff for the building and the tariff for the PV system are often different. And in fact, in the EU, feed-in tariffs are one of the policies that's used to encourage or subsidize renewable energy. Next slide, Connie. So when the PV system has its own meter, we're already using the grid to deliver energy to the building. Next. So if we move that PV system off-site, but in the same general vicinity of the building, next, we can still deliver power to the building, and RECs can be used to track production and make sure that the renewable energy is not double counted, and assign it to our zero energy building. Next. So another benefit is when we move off-site, we can build larger systems that are shared by multiple buildings, and we can achieve the economies of scale. And this is another benefit. Next slide. So there's a number of financial arrangements or procurement options that are already out there for off-site renewable energy. And some of these have been widely used by tech companies like Amazon and Google. And we've grouped these into three classes based on the probability of additionality, long-term commitment, and other criteria. The first class has a pretty high probability of additional renewable energy and other benefits. Next. The second class is less desirable. This includes green tariffs and direct access to the wholesale market. The main problem here is that customers can easily opt out. Next slide. Our least favorite option are unbundled RECs. We think these have little probability of additionality. Next slide. And you can go to the Zero Code website and download a document that explains these options in way more detail. Next, Connie. So in creating the classes, we considered 9 criteria that we think are important, although some are more important than others. At the top of the list are additionality and long-term commitment, and some of the other things are at the bottom. Next slide. We've also identified a number of minimum requirements that all of the procurement options must embrace, having a long-term commitment, a legally binding contract. The RECs have to come with it, and several other things that are mentioned here. Next slide. So the Zero Code uses the concept of procurement factors to account for the additional risks that are associated with off-site procurement. And we have 3 separate factors, one for each class of procurement. Next slide. So to illustrate how this works, you start with the quantity of renewable energy that's being purchased. And then this is then first multiplied times the source energy factor, and then multiplied again times the procurement factor, and the result is the avoided source energy that you can credit towards your building. So it's a simple concept, and as we get more confidence in off-site procurement methods, I think the procurement factors will begin to approach 1. And in some areas, they may already be close to 1 if we have a lot of confidence. Next slide. So batteries can be installed behind the meter, and you would typically charge the battery in the middle of the day when there's a lot of solar, and you would discharge the battery in the early evening and in the morning to kind of offset that goal wing curve we saw earlier. Next. Conventional thermal mass can also be used to shift loads. In this case, you would operate in a manner just the opposite of convention, though. You would cool the building in the middle of the day when there's a lot of solar, and then you would let the building drift in the morning and the evening. Next slide. And conventional thermal storage can also be used to shift load, but again, you would operate it differently. Typically, with thermal storage, you make chilled water at night and melt it in the day. But with a solar-rich grid, you would do just the opposite. You would run the chillers and make ice in the middle of the day, and then you shut off the chillers in the morning and the evening, and melt the ice during those times. Next slide, Connie. Next. So anyway, the Zero Code for California represents, we think, a paradigm shift in that it directly addresses carbon emissions and it encourages a more grid-friendly buildings. And also with the offsite procurement, it establishes a framework for tall buildings and energy-intensive buildings that have always sort of been a problem. Next. And then if you're interested in learning more, there's several documents that are available at it's actually cut off at the bottom, but the website is zero-code.org website. You can download these documents and they have a lot of backup for what I presented. So anyway, thank you for your time and happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you so much, Charles. Really excellent technical background for these the topic of our webinar today. So having that technical understanding is really helpful to understand how we're going to be moving codes forward. A couple of questions. One is, at this point, would it be useful or beneficial to orient solar systems to the west to help with the duck curve challenge in places like California?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, we've always, the guidelines for the azimuth of solar collectors and also the tilt of solar collectors have been based on maximizing annual production. But if your goal is to maximize or to offset or avoid the maximum amount of hourly source energy, yeah, you would consider different tilts and different azimuths. And I think that kind of opens up a whole new way of thinking about solar collectors. And also tracking collectors look a lot better too, Rob, because they can face the east in the morning and the west in the afternoon, and they have a much higher power factor.
All right, thank you. Another good question. It says, seems like zero code abandons efficiency as the primary means of dealing with building climate impacts.
We don't think that's the case. We set the minimum efficiency at code minimum, but the zero code actually encourages you to go way beyond code minimum, because if you've got a multi-fuel building, you would have to acquire more or install more renewable energy to make up for that, and also reducing the building load itself and shifting load from the evening hours into the solar periods can be just as effective as installing more renewable. I think we need to look more at what kinds of building options are going to be encouraged by TDS, but we think that efficiency gains that go way beyond code minimum will be encouraged, and we certainly do that.
Yeah, and as Jim was sharing, there is a shift in the conversation to these complementary elements of zero energy buildings, and so efficiency is still very important, but there are new players in this discussion. Okay, so now I think we'll move to Christopher Meyer. Christopher, go ahead and take it away.
Good morning, everyone. So I will just give you sort of a brief, very high-level overview of sort of 10 years of work that culminated in adding PVs to low-rise residential as one of the sort of big things in our code recently. But basically, it's like, as all of you are probably aware of, about 10 years ago, ended up with a sort of a big, bold goal of, Z&E for residential buildings by 2020 and non-res by 2030. And as we got, closer to these, these sort of really good aspirational goals allowed us to make huge strides in building energy efficiency in the envelope and the appliances, because we realized that just adding very large renewable generation to basically solve it sort of as an accounting exercise of just adding a lot of renewable generation to offset a lot of electrical load was not the appropriate answer because of unintended consequences to grid. So we focused on the efficiency first to get the size of the systems down. So that was sort of one of our big lessons that when we started trying to figure out how to make the traditional Z&E definition work, we realized we needed to modify it and just look at PV that offset electric generation. So next slide. So yeah, very simply, as Charles and others have talked about, California, we have 16 climate zones, and measures that work in one don't always work in other ones. So we have to make sure that we're not creating an energy penalty by having some measures in some states, in some areas of the state, as you can imagine. Whole house fans, giving them a lot of credit in an area like Palm Springs that doesn't cool off is, would be trading off better measures, the same as a cool roof in an area that is a heating climate zone. So it would actually require them to have more energy. So that's something that we spent a lot of time on. Our standards, we are required to look at cost effectiveness. So we use the life cycle costing methodology. So to make sure that that's done, we use the time dependent valuation because it protects the customer from sort of the time of use issues. And also we found that it really allows us to focus on measures that can try to shift energy consumption away from the high carbon areas of the day as well. So why don't we go to the next slide, if you would. I'm just going to go through these really quickly. It's just in 2019, on the non-res side, we really focused on going to the LED baseline, which was a huge savings, and then just did a lot of clarification, including color temperature for indoor, outdoor lighting. So next. And for residential standards, we'll talk a little bit more about the PV separately, but one of the things we realized is that indoor air quality is one of the things we have to look at. And if you have an efficient building and people can afford to run their HVAC systems and move air through, they can control bad indoor air quality from either indoor sources, outdoor sources. As we found, we were tightening up the buildings. You ended up with adverse issues, adverse indoor air quality, either from cooking or other indoor sources, or from outdoor sources such as pollution from vehicles or other sources. So we found that you could actually have filters that went down to PM 2.5 without having energy penalties on them. So that was a huge step we worked with ARB on, and that was a realization that we had to make sure that the energy in the buildings was such that people could afford to run their systems so that they didn't conserve energy and have an air quality impact. So next slide. And I'll get to, as I said, the photo a little bit more. Once again, in our load node, we focused on the efficiency first with better windows, better insulation requirements. We took QII to a prescriptive rather than an option, and increased the U factor for walls and the insulation in the ceilings. One big thing we did for moving ahead to help with either electrification or GHG issues was to work really hard to take away any barriers to electric water heating through heat pumps. So we've been doing a lot of work to try to make heat pumps as easy as possible to integrate in the climate zones that they make sense. Next. So as you can imagine, we were really looking forward we're going in the future towards the GHG reduction goals, cost effectiveness and energy in the 2019 standards, working with both stakeholders and other agencies. Just, we agreed early on with the PUC, CAISO, that we didn't want an energy code that shifted the burden onto the PUC to deal with, grid harmonization issues. We had to make sure that what we did promoted the demand flexibility. And when we talk about self-utilization, we're really talking about designing a code that looked at behind the meter PV on residential houses as a load minimizing strategy.
Christopher?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm getting some feedback from people that they're having a difficult time hearing you. Can you get closer to the mic or speak up, please?
Okay, apologies. So is that a little bit better, hopefully?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Okay, so anyway, as I was saying, it's like we're trying very hard in these, in the 2019 code to have the house interact with the grid as little as possible. So we're using PV, behind the meter PV, as a conservation measure to sort of minimize the load of that house that the utilities need to deal with as far as grid, any grid or infrastructure increases that would have possible socialized cost implement issues with non-participants. So next. So anyway, that's when we put the standards together for the PV, we realized that it's not going to work on all houses. So even though we keep these sizes of these systems very small, average around 2.8 kilowatts for the systems, we wanted to make sure there are exceptions for if there's existing external shading, multi-stories with limited roof space. Also, we included a provision that if a utility or someone comes in with a community solar option that meets certain criteria, that would be an allowable option for option to the PV requirements. As I said before, the thing we were trying to do a few different things. We were trying to sort of protect the consumer, the homeowner from rate issues, give them the benefits of having a little bit more control over their energy consumption, but also we didn't want to have a bunch of houses that use more energy than necessary from the grid and cause another problem. Community solar can solve some of these, but not necessarily all of them. But so we're working with them to try to address some of the issues that Charles talked about earlier, as far as making sure that if it's going to be an off-site system, that it's an additional resource, it's dedicated to the home, it's durable, it has benefits to the homeowner, and is sort of grid harmonized and administratively feasible. So next slide. So one of the things we did in our research version of our CBEC modeling software is for the 2019, we added a feature in there so that you could model the building based on energy efficiency, but you could look and see how that impacted the CO2 emissions of that house. So you could, in the future, look towards low GHG emission houses and see how well you could do with getting emissions down within the authority the Energy Commission has on cost-effective efficiency measures. Because as all of you know, Warren Alquist is pretty clear of what our authority is, and it doesn't, at this point, include the ability to have measures based on greenhouse gases. We still have to do cost-effective energy efficiency measures. So next slide.
Christopher, again, please speak up a little bit more. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. I think I'm going to hold on just one moment. Can you hear me better now?
Oh, that's very much better. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm abandoning the headset and we'll do this old school. So one of the things we looked at is, through the different standards, how energy efficiency measures in buildings impacted the carbon emissions from those buildings. So if you look back, 2000, you're looking at 6.5 tons going, even without PV, going to a 2016 building got you down to 3.26. We went a little farther with 2019 by adding, a small PV system, and this is a 2,700 square foot. So you're looking, instead of a 2.8, you're looking about 3.1. And then if you go all electric, you move down even farther. And what we didn't include here is if you add battery, you get down, to the like 0.08 level with a decent battery size. So we found that energy efficiency measures, mainly if you add behind the meter storage, whether it's thermal storage or battery storage, you can really reduce your CO2 of the building by minimizing use of energy from the grid when the grid was higher in GHG intensity. So next slide. So basically, as we're looking forward with AB 3232 and other policy goals to move towards a more GHG matrix, we're working on how we can do that within our authority. But luckily, we found that by focusing on energy efficiency of the building and having as much of the consumption of buildings met by renewable energy sources, we can get very close to those GHG goals. And once again, we're trying to get away from this idea of netting. We don't want to inadvertently use an accounting exercise to solve an engineering problem. As you can imagine, we don't want a house that has a large PV system that exports a lot of energy to the grid that the utility has to deal with, and then uses a lot of energy during the utility peak, and it all nets out to zero. So we want to make sure that the house is acting as responsibly as possible, using as much energy on site as possible if they have a behind the meter PV system. So next. And this gives people just a brief idea of what our schedule is. As we're finishing up 2019, getting ready for that to go online. We're already starting our 2022 standards. So the end of 2019, we're going to start having the IOU hosted workshops on where we're going in 2022. And, we basically value the participation of all stakeholders from different backgrounds, different ideas, so that we can have a really fruitful standards process. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Christopher. It's great to hear how things are progressing in California with the California Energy Commission. I have a good question here. Can Title 24 code shift to time-dependent source, I guess away from TDV, for energy code compliance as a way to include both energy and emissions?
We are looking at that. That is going to be the source of several meetings and a lot of discussions trying to figure out how we can do that within our cost effectiveness analysis to make sure that we don't include any factors that sort of either allow trade-offs that hit us in the efficiency of the building. Mm-hmm. So it's something we have a lot of work going ahead to see what we can do, and we may end up with a more of a hybrid approach that is time-dependent valuation with a backup metric of greenhouse gas emissions as a screening tool for standards.
Mm-hmm.
So that's going to be a very interesting conversation going forward, and we have a lot of people working on that with at the Energy Commission right now.
Great, and there is a question, and maybe I'll modify it a little bit. You know, I know you'd mentioned that you're trying to work on a level playing field for electric heat pumps versus gas equipment. What do you think the future direction is in terms of electrification or decarbonization policy in California?
That is going to be a very, very interesting one. There's a lot of research going on trying to figure out what the unintended consequences of shifting, you know, mainly new construction or retrofits away from gas appliances, and whether preemption is going to play a part in that, and if there's ways of addressing preemption issues on federally allowed gas appliances, and you know what the unintended consequences to non-participants might be if we have a shrinking number of ratepayers in California that are going to have to bear the burden of infrastructure maintenance on natural gas. So we basically we're working very hard on looking at finding alternatives to gas uses that right now don't have an easy electric alternative.
Mm-hmm.
It's something we're looking at within our authority and trying to find ways of incentivizing low emission uses to the extent we can without running preemption risks.
Right, and both the Air Resources Board and the Public Utilities Commission are trying to address these as well in their own regulatory framework, right?
Yes, and what we've added is in our IPER, we've added a whole section on decarbonization. So
right.
From the current IPER we're working on going forward, there will always be a section that's just devoted to this effort.
Great. All right. Thank you, Christopher. Let's move to our last panelist, Bill Updike. All right. Love to hear what you have to say, Bill. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Ralph. We're going to now move away from the Disneyland of zero codes and policy in California to the rest of North America. Next slide. So Integral Group, for those of you who don't know, we're over 550 staff globally now of folks that are passionate about addressing climate change from an engineering and consulting perspective. Next slide. A lot of leadership in the firm around deep green engineering in particular. Just went over 100 net zero energy projects on the firm's books sometime this summer. So a lot of activity in that space. Next slide. So, you know, Charles talked a little bit about the Architecture 2030, the zero code there. There's a lot of activity happening globally around zero energy and zero carbon buildings. You've got the World Green Building Council that's made a zero carbon commitment for all buildings by 2050, not just talking about new construction, but all buildings. You've got ASHRAE itself driving towards net zero. You heard Jim talk about the proposed appendix for a zero energy code in IECC as well. Next slide. This sort of lays out some of the ones, at least that I know of, who've made commitments, governmental entities. You've got Santa Monica over there on the left, and obviously California playing a huge role. You know, Vancouver and Oregon and Washington, D.C. has now had some commitments made in a plan I'll talk about later. You've got Japan and Cambridge, some work there happening. I'm sure there are many more. But this just gives you a sense of there's a lot of activity in this space in the next, you know, few decades. Next slide. So some of the work that we've done in the space around either zero carbon cities or zero carbon or zero energy buildings and standards. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of these pieces as we go forward. Next slide. So the Zero Carbon Building Standard, this was developed for the Canada Green Building Council. It's currently in pilot phase. There's a number of projects running through the standard and pilot mode, and I think the intent is to, take it from there and make it a bigger program after the pilot phase. But really focused around performance and in particular this concept of the TEDI, or the thermal energy intensity of a building, demand intensity of a building. Really focus around driving those loads down and focusing on the building envelopes to make them more efficient, so that when you're trying to get to zero, the amount of renewable energy that you have to either put on site or procure from the grid is lowered. Obviously, there's also the benefit of increased building envelope efficiency has the benefit to help to soften some of those duct curve issues that Charles talked about earlier. Zero Carbon Building Standard for Canada also has reporting requirements for EUI, peak demand, and embodied carbon. Somebody asked a question earlier about embodied carbon. So there is a reporting requirement in the Zero Carbon Building Standard for Canada around embodied carbon. Next slide. This is Vancouver Zero Emissions Building Plan. So similar, established limits for carbon emissions for the thermal energy demand intensity, the TEDI, and EUI. Does offer an alternative compliance path for passive house, and requires, good quality testing for air tightness, enhanced compliance, as well as metering, infrastructure, and benchmarking of buildings. Next slide. Similarly, I guess in some ways, but slightly different in Toronto, the Zero Emissions Building Framework. So the concept here, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in the next slide as well, is showing the pathway to get to zero emissions by 2030 through these stepped goals in terms of the framework. So having stepped greenhouse gas and energy targets from the time that the framework was put together to 2030 to kind of ease the transition over time to get to zero emissions for the city of Toronto. There's both performance and there's a set of prescriptive requirements in this framework, and it also includes a climate change resilience checklist for buildings, which I think is a nice innovation and really important if we're trying to make our buildings both climate friendly from a mitigation perspective, but also able to handle some of the impacts that are coming our way. Next slide. So this is the BC Energy Step Code. This is for British Columbia, for those of you who don't know the acronym BC. And similar to what I just mentioned for Toronto, this idea of having a step code, or this sort of pathway to get to net zero, or in this case, net zero ready for new construction in the codes over time, kind of outlining that over the next few years to get to their 2032 goal of net zero ready for new construction in the code there. And similarly, standard for air tightness for TEDI and for total energy use intensity as well. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about what's happening in DC, because this is a code that was just introduced for public comment actually in September of this year. Prior to joining Integral Group, I managed green building and climate policy and programs for the city government in Washington, DC. And the city has a strong history of progressive green building policy dating back to 2006 with the landmark Green Building Act back then, and energy and water benchmarking law in 2008, which was the first in the US, and a lot of things around renewable energy and finance. We adopted the International Green Construction Code as a mandatory code in 2014. Just this year signed a bill to create a green bank in DC, which depending on how you treat NYSEG, I guess would be one of the first of its kind in the US for a city to have a green bank. This year was the release of the Clean Energy DC plan, which is the energy and climate plan for the city. It was a project that Integral Group did for DC, and it is relevant to this conversation because it puts some date targets in for a zero code requirement for DC. And that proposed zero code is out for public comment right now. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. Next slide. So like I mentioned, the Clean Energy DC plan calls for a net zero code for required mandatory code for residential 2020 and for all other buildings essentially in 2026 in the 2026 code cycle. In sort of a way to prepare for the future for that, we developed in the last code cycle, which has now been introduced for public comment, like I mentioned in September, we adopted, or not adopted, we introduced what we're calling Appendix Z, just to try to be a bit clever, like us code nerds can be sometimes, which is our net zero energy pathway for commercial buildings. Part of the vision is it will be a voluntary alternative compliance pathway in this code cycle. And you know, the city is looking into potential incentive structures, both financial and regulatory or structural, in order to try to get some building owners to use Appendix Z now, so that when the code becomes mandatory for single family in the next code cycle, and then for all other buildings in 3 code cycles from now, I guess 2 or 3 code cycles from now, that folks will have a chance to have used it and to get more familiar with it. There's also a lot of activity in DC around support for district energy and microgrids, and we can talk more about that later. Next slide. So in addition to the Appendix Z, which is, like I mentioned, an optional alternative compliance path for the energy code in the city, the baseline energy code in the last code cycle, we basically, what we did was attempt to merge 90.1 2013 and ASHRAE 189.1 together to create a more efficient sort of base energy code for DC. We started this process, in DC it takes quite a long time. It's a great process because it's a public-private kind of partnership, but it takes quite a long time to do it. And so when we started, ASHRAE 90.1 2016 was not out yet. We actually finished their proposals on the code right before 2016 came out. So this code is based on 2013, but this attempt to merge 189.1. We also developed this before NBI came out with the stretch code, which would have been very useful from a time perspective on our part. But we did what we could to try to create a more advanced baseline code for DC. It still has both prescriptive and performance pathways in it. On the residential side, there are very significant changes to the residential energy code in DC. Essentially, I would say basically to the point of net zero ready. Levels of efficiency on the residential side are close to it. And then, like I mentioned, it adds Appendix Z, or the Zero Energy Code pathway for commercial, and also allows for other alternative compliance paths, Living Building Challenge, either full or pedal certification, the Zero Energy certification from ILFI, or Passive House Plus as alternative compliance paths to the energy code. Next
Bill,
slide. Yep.
You've got about 3 minutes left.
Great. So these are some of the savings in terms of percent reductions proposed over 90.1 2010. Next slide. So just digging in a little deeper on Appendix Z, the beauty of this is it's outcome-based code and performance-based, and so it's 6 pages versus the I don't know how many pages the baseline code is, but certainly over 100. And the goal, I think, of the code intent in DC to get to this zero energy code requirement is really to move into this performance-based model where we have a much cleaner way to comply with the code. We are using the ZEPI tool, and it's targeted at a score of 40 or lower. The base code actually, because 2016 had just come out, we actually are adopting Appendix G of 2016 as the performance path for the base code, plus the use of ComNet, and that's also adopted for the Appendix Z. There are thermal energy performance targets. We don't call them TEDI like in Canada, but there are thermal energy performance targets in the code, and you can see them there. There's some guidance around how to account for multiple buildings using district energy systems. There's a requirement for using registered design professional for building energy simulations for some quality control there. Both the baseline code and the Appendix Z require, this is our first effort at requiring building envelope commissioning. So that's in just in the base energy code, but also obviously in Appendix Z as well. There's guidance for air tightness testing in the next slide, please. As well as guidance for renewable energy. We're not allowing on-site combustion at this point. I don't know if that will change when the code the zero energy code or zero carbon code becomes mandatory, but currently not allowing for on-site combustion. You see the list of acceptable sources of renewable energy biogases on there, but it would only be allowed to be used in a non-combustion technology like a fuel cell. And then guidance around how folks can go off-site for renewable energy after they've maximized on-site for the larger buildings in the city. We also have information or guidance requirements around energy metering and monitoring in the buildings, as well as reporting. Like I mentioned, this is a outcome-based code. It's different than the Architecture 2030 Zero code, focused around actual performance in outcome. And part of the reason why we built it as an outcome-based code is because we were talking about tying significant structural and financial incentives to this, and we wanted to make sure that the buildings were going to actually perform to what they were designed to be, and not miss the mark, because it would not be good from a political perspective to have provided somebody with an incentive and have the building not meet the mark. Next slide. I mentioned this before. These are alternative compliance paths for the energy code in DC, as well as Appendix Z. Next slide. And I think, this is generally, you've sort of heard most of this already, I think, from the other presenters, but this shift, I think we're already moving towards absolute metrics, a real focus on carbon, and moving to managing emerging loads and grid optimization. I think we're going to see more of legislated fuel switching from gas to electric. Obviously, you're going to see more decarbonized grids, and I think in particular to address peak demand and issues around peak, and some of the other issues around like the duck curve in California and other places. You're going to see quite more focus around distributed energy resources. So I think that's it for me. I appreciate it and happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Bill. And that was an excellent summary of what's happening, broadly, and giving us both a historical perspective and also what the future holds. So actually, this slide is a great one for us to come back to when we have more discussion. So Connie, I think if we could just move through the last few slides, then we'll have our Q&A. Thank you, Bill. So we have set up a landing page for you to go and get information, a lot of the resources we talked about, these codes, the research and papers that we have to share. So all of the panelists and New Buildings Institute are bringing all of these things together as resources, and you can go to this link, which will be in the recorded webinar and the PowerPoint that we will provide you with tomorrow. So if you're looking for more of these resources, you'll have access to them on our website. Next slide. Great. Okay, so Connie, if you want to go back to Bill's summary slide, that might be good. And Bill, well, actually, let me point out a few things. So someone posted that the Zero Carbon program in Canada is up and running, and it's not a pilot anymore, and there are 3 projects certified already. Also pointing out that ILFI has the Zero Carbon standard, which NBI was also involved in partnering with them, and has 3 million square feet registered, including the Salesforce Tower in San Francisco. Bill, let's see, I know we had a good question here. Of the codes, in the work that you've done, are they requiring all electric, or is there a way in which they're offsetting fossil fuel combustion?
Yeah, I'd have to ask some of my colleagues who developed some of the work in Canada. I know the Zero code in DC does not allow for fossil fuels. There's only an allowance for biogas, but only if it's used in fuel cell. I believe that I know that at least the Vancouver standard also doesn't allow for fossil fuel use. I'd have to ask some of my colleagues about Toronto and the overall Canada Zero Carbon standard.
Great. Okay, so thank you, Bill, and thank you to all our panelists. We only have a few minutes left, so we'd love to get to a couple of more questions. And I would just, again, share my gratitude. This has been an outstanding panel and really gives a great sense of the landscape. And so maybe moving on to some of our next questions. Maybe, I guess, any of the panelists, are you seeing, support of these codes with utility program incentives, and are those helping to start to drive or develop the market? And anyone who wants to respond to that.
Well, this is Charles. We're starting to see a bit of it here in California. In fact, there's a meeting on Monday to discuss it in a little more detail. And I think having utility incentives to encourage REACH codes is an excellent way to kind of begin the process. It's going to be a while before we're able to make these codes mandatory, and the more we can get comfortable with them in the meantime, the better.
Thanks, Charles. I will also point out that the Energy Trust here in Oregon has launched, they had a pilot Path to Net Zero program, which is now a full-fledged program. So I think we're seeing this emergence of net zero or zero energy incentive programs that are coming up and helping to build market.
There's a really, Ralph, this is Bill, there's a really nice nicely designed incentive program for the BC Hydro STEP code, both for the STEP code itself and higher levels, but then also for the zero energy or zero carbon side of it. So, and I know that, the conversations are happening in DC as well. We have our own sustainable energy utility that does the efficiency program in the city, and I know some conversations are happening around incentive structures as we speak.
All right, so Bill, there have been a couple of questions that have come in about DC. Can you just quickly, we know that you passed the legislation for the Green Bank. Can you tell us how you think the adoption of a Green Bank in the District of Columbia will help to advance zero energy, and how the Appendix, Appendix E will fit into that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the intent of the Green Bank, like other green banks in the state green banks in the country, is really to use some public capital dollars to leverage private capital investments in particular for projects that have a hard time getting the investment dollars they need from traditional banking structures. So the intent is to provide, credit enhancement to try to enable some projects to happen that wouldn't normally happen otherwise. And I would say net zero energy or potentially net zero carbon buildings are very good candidates for that enabling to happen, because some of the traditional banking finance structures don't really take into account the benefits of zero energy buildings in terms of their financing. And so the Green Bank has at least the potential to step into that market gap and that void and fill it.
Great, and yeah, providing, I think, much needed capital to make all of this move forward. So another good question here, basically asking, what's the intrinsic value of a zero energy building? The question is asking, for example, why does it make sense for society to put photovoltaics on the roof of a building in San Francisco that doesn't get a lot of sunshine, and instead of putting it into something, for instance, in the Central Valley, or better yet, utility scale array. And I know, Charles, you covered a lot of this, but talking about, and there was another similar question about short buildings, like one-story buildings versus tall buildings, and how you address that. So I think, Charles, if you could address how codes will be addressing the issue of on-site versus off-site renewables, and how you're handling that with zero code.
Well, I think it's a really important question. You mentioned the Salesforce Tower. There's absolutely no way they could become a zero energy building if you have to do it all on site. But there's so many off-site options that are available today, and there's energy brokers like 3 Degrees and Altenex and others that can work with building owners to help them procure off-site renewables, and they have a lot of benefits. Right now we have procurement factors that are less than 1, but some people have actually argued that off-site renewables have more benefits than on-site renewables, and in many ways that's true, because the ISOs and the RTOs can have some control over the grid level systems. They can curtail them if they need to, and right now they don't have that control over most on-site systems. Although this is beginning to change, I think the Energy Commission and others are looking at requirements for smart inverters, and those smart inverters may be able to communicate directly with the grid and make the on-site systems more friendly.
Yeah.
Ralph, it's important to remember, I think, the story came out just yesterday that there's been a 60% reduction in wildlife species in the last 50 years.
40 years, yeah.
Globally, 40 years globally, and I think it's just something we need to factor in. I think we need to think about the whole sort of environmental picture of the planet when we're thinking about siting renewables. It's just something that needs to be thought of as well.
Yeah,
it's a good point from a land use.
For the Energy Commission, I can sort of second that. I worked on a lot of the about 24 square miles of solar thermal projects. Luckily, some of them actually didn't come to fruition because of, some of them had upwards of 500 archaeological sites and multiple endangered species on them. So, there's cost implications. So luckily, I think utility scale solar, they're starting to rethink it, trying to focus on brownfield sites, on sites that provide other benefits like shading over parking lots. So I agree that we need to have a multi-pronged approach of looking at both on-site and off-site, but the off-site projects need to really focus on the environmental impacts as well as just the greenhouse gas benefits.
Yeah, and thank you, Bill and Christopher. I think the urgency and the speed with which we need to move, we do need to think about all those complex implications of the choices we're making. And we know, zero energy buildings are possible. We're building them today and we're operating them today. These codes are going to help really to transform the building industry and really bring about the market transformation that we need. There's been this has been a tremendous panel. We have a lot of excellent questions that we have not had a chance to get to. So we are going to share those questions with the panelists, and then we'll summarize both the questions and the responses, and we will post those to that same website. And so I do want to take this time to thank everyone for joining us. We had an excellent turnout. It was a tremendous panel, and we are so excited to move forward with these topics. So please share your gratitude with the panelists through the chat, and please do complete the survey. Connie, I think we might have one or two more slides about our resources, or I guess that we had that maybe if you could go to that resource page one more time. So again, looking for this website, and then we'll be posting the resources there. So again, thank you so much to our panelists, and it was an excellent presentation. I look forward to following up with you and everyone who is participating in this webinar. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
All right.